Now, throughout much of human history, the pre-modern period, war fighting was a fairly specialised occupation, and there were limits, therefore, to the waging of war. For example, throughout medieval times in Europe, the Normans were the last successful conquest of England in the year 1066, and their devastating weapon was the knight in full plate armour. And the reason why that was so successful was because it could resist the bows and arrows, which were the weapon of choice for the Saxons, who had invaded England some centuries earlier. But, of course, having a set of full plate armour was a very expensive business, and it meant that you effectively pulled down quite a large share of the available resources at the time. So the people who took part in those battles were basically fairly wealthy, and battles themselves, war itself, did not really involve that many people. So that set an obvious limit to the extent of the waging of war. Now, time went on, of course, and war fighting evolved, and new weapons were devised. And by the time of the modern period, by the time of the Industrial Revolution, some of those limits began to be lifted. Clearly, if you have factories churning out arms and armaments, then you have arms and ammunition in literally industrial quantities. So to get your hands on enough of the impedimenta of war to actually take part in it and wage war, that ceased to be quite such a big ask. And it ceased to pull down quite such a large share of the resources available to the society, and therefore an important constraint on the waging of war was removed. And so the wars of the modern era, arguably beginning with the Crimean War or the American Civil War in the 1850s, 1860s, these began to see new tactics being employed, resting on some of the innovations made possible by the Industrial Revolution. So, for example, the tactical use of rail to move these enormous quantities of arms and ammunition long distances at rapid rates. Area artillery fire. So you no longer waited until the enemy became visible on the hilltop opposite to start firing. Instead, why not deny the use of that hilltop to the enemy by firing at it regardless? You had enough shells, enough guns to make that feasible. And therefore, because of the lifting of these constraints, war fighting began to become more destructive. That process, of course, reached its apogee, or perhaps its nadir, in the First World War, which saw enormous armies fighting over relatively short stretches of ground with huge resulting casualties. And by that time, the only remaining constraint on the extent of the waging of war was really the number of men you could mobilise. Hence the words of the English historian Eric Hobsbawm that what moved, therefore, to the top of the political agenda was the appeal to nationalism, to motivate people to join in the war. And he also wryly remarks that the war, the First World War, was presented to the peoples of all the belligerent countries as a way to improve the living conditions for the poorest. So the proposition was, if you do your patriotic duty and you join the war effort, you accept the call to conscription, then you will be doing something to improve the prospects for yourself, if you survive, of course, and your family in years to come. So these phenomena emerged as some of the hallmarks of modern war making: the mass mobilizations, the increasing depredations of the war effort on the productive capacity of society, factories converted to military use, etc., and the extreme nationalist rhetoric and nationalist ideas to mobilize people to join in. But the result was a very highly destructive, highly costly exercise without those limitations, without those constraints coming in, and therefore that bequeathed its own problem. And the history of peacemaking in the modern era, which I will consider in the next mini-lecture, should be seen as, in a sense, a response to the horrors of the First World War and the impetus that was widely felt afterwards to do something to reapply some kind of constraint, some kind of limit to the extent of war fighting.